What's up, everybody? G on the Morgile here, checking in for a quick flurfer video for you. So, real quick, I just wanted to respond to some comments that I've gotten for the last 10 years, but then recently there's been a slew of these comments. And I'll just touch on one point in this video, and we'll do others later on. But let's talk about the airline flights conundrum on your spinning ball Earth, okay? So, the point that I've been making for about a decade now and getting the same non arguments back from the globbers involves airline flights, which, so eastbound flights and westbound flights over thousands of miles are often identical in terms of their duration. So, like, an example that I'll use is New York to LA and LA to New York. So, one flight to the west and a return flight the same distance to the east. Now, oftentimes these two flights are similar in duration. You could even go so far as to say they're often identical in duration. And this is, unfortunately for the ball Earth, categorically impossible on spinning ball Earth, right? Because you got to remember, on spinning ball Earth, you're traveling east faster than the speed of sound, according to them. 1,000 miles an hour plus at the equator. And then, of course, allegedly, according to the ball Earth physics, the further you get away from the equator, the slower you're spinning, up to the point at the North Pole where they claim, you're spinning half the speed as the hour hand on a 12-hour clock. The point being, though, so if you're taking off in an airplane from New York and heading west to, say, Los Angeles, that's a 2,500 mile flight, but you're supposedly racing towards a destination. And we'll say the plane's going 500 miles an hour. That destination is also supposedly racing towards the plane at that latitude. We'll say 750 miles an hour for round numbers, whatever the case is. Between 750 and 1,000 miles an hour is what they claim. On the other hand, the plane heading from LA back to New York is also going to be doing 500 miles an hour, but instead of enjoying that luxury of having the destination racing towards the nose of the plane at 1,000 miles an hour, the plane would be racing against the destination, right? So the two are going in a similar direction, according to the ball Earth theory. And yet, these two flights are oftentimes identical in terms of duration. Actually, sometimes you'll find that the eastbound flight is much shorter in terms of duration than the westbound flight. Exactly the opposite of what you would expect if the globe and all destinations were racing supersonic-like towards the east, right? So the globbers, what they've been saying for the last 10 years, because they refuse to consider this logically, is that, well, the atmosphere is racing along with the face of the Earth at whatever the 1,000 miles an hour happens to be. And so by this illogic, the plane and the destinations and the atmosphere that the planes are flying in are all racing towards the east, supersonic-like, variable depending on the latitude north of the equator, right? So there's this very smart gradient of atmosphere in lockstep with the spinning globe, depending on the latitude of that given location arbitrarily, right? And that's how they justify this in their minds, because, see, they start with the assumption, the unassailable assumption, that the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what. And so they work backwards from that. They're going to say the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what. And the other data point here is that these two flights are often identical in terms of their duration. And so, by their logic, they have to come up with an apologetic excuse as to how this is possible on their spinning ball Earth. And of course, they're going to come up with the atmosphere is velcroed to the spinning ball Earth, variable with its latitude, right? That's what every globetard says for the last 10 years, because they have to work backwards from the assumption that the Earth is a spinning ball spinning 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. The two flights arrive at their destinations at similar durations, and so there must be some logical explanation for this. Now, here's the thing, though. So what they're saying is that the atmosphere is velcroed to the spinning ball Earth. By what mechanism? Nobody has bothered to explain what mechanism allows for the atmosphere to stay, synchronized in lockstep with spinning ball Earth. But I would say, where is the evidence for this 1,000 mile per hour, atmosphere spinning around the ball Earth? By this logic, you would have to assume that all eastbound flights experience tailwinds as a rule, and all westbound flights would experience headwinds as a rule, right? But that's not what happens. There are headwinds and tailwinds depending on the location, and even conflicting wind velocities depending on your elevation. So you'll have winds aloft that might be north to south, and then 1,000 feet higher or lower than that, you might have winds aloft that are going in the complete opposite direction. There is no evidence for this assertion by Team Glauber that all of the atmosphere is spinning 1,000 miles an hour, or 800 miles an hour, or whatever the case is, according to that latitude. There are no headwinds for all westbound flights and tailwinds for all eastbound flights, and furthermore, this is to suggest that airplanes are incapable of traveling independent of the atmosphere, or atmosplane, if you forgive the vernacular. Um, Here's the thing: airplanes are designed with aerodynamics in mind, right? So they maximize on thrust and minimize on drag in order to fly. That's principles they have to deal with. Airplanes are flying around independent of the atmosphere. Sure, winds aloft do play a huge role on ground speed and airspeed, but at the end of the day, airplanes are not beholden to the whims of the environment. Airplanes are going to accelerate through the atmosphere regardless of what it's doing. But there's something that everyone, or at least the Glaubers, seem to be missing, is apart from the atmosphere, you're talking about a very simple fact of nature, an immutable law of physics. And that is to say that when objects are traveling towards one another, they're going to meet in the middle somewhere. And objects that are racing against one another are not going to meet in the middle as the two objects in the first example, right? And so, an analogy that I'll give, just so that you'll understand, or you'll be able to think about this without confusing yourself, because it is very simple. If you imagine a football field with the two end zones and two field goal posts, and if you stand at one end zone and you have a friend or an enemy stand in the opposite end zone, and the two of you begin walking towards one another, just walking towards one another, you're going to expect to meet up somewhere near the 50-yard line, right? Now, on the other hand, if you try this same experiment, for lack of a better phrase, however, instead of your friend walking towards you, they about faced and start Forrest Gumping it away from the football field altogether, like into the away team's locker room, and you start walking towards the 50-yard line. Would you still expect to meet your friend somewhere near the 50-yard line as you did when y'all started walking towards one another? And of course, the obvious answer to this is of course not. And yet, that's exactly what we're expected to believe is occurring on spinning ball Earth. Because remember, the westbound flight from New York to LA is achieved in about the same amount of time, at least some of the time, as the return flight from LA back to New York. When in the first example, the airplane and the destination are racing towards one another, much like you and your friend in the example when you would meet at the 50-yard line, and yet on the return flight, you're allegedly racing against the destination, which makes it physically impossible, regardless of what the atmosphere is doing. It makes it physically impossible that these two flight durations would be even remotely similar ever. And yet we find time and time again that's exactly what to expect, is that these two flight durations are often very similar. And again, there are lots of examples where the eastbound flight, because of favorable winds aloft conditions, the eastbound flights are much shorter in terms of duration than the westbound flights. Again, that's exactly the opposite of what you'd expect to see if the Earth and all the destinations were spinning towards the east. Think about it this way. In order for these two flights to be even similar in terms of their duration, so again, LA to New York and back, the plane taking off heading west, enjoying the benefit of the destination, racing towards the nose of the plane, would actually have to fly backwards in order to assure that the return flight would be similar in terms of duration. Because again, really the westbound flight could just take off and hover in place if the Earth and all the destinations were spinning towards the east. But again, so they're saying that the atmosphere is velcroed to the frame of reference with the ground below, according to the latitude, without any evidence for this assertion. And yet the Coriolis effect, another globe Earth alleged proof, demands that the atmosphere is not velcroed in lockstep to the ground beneath. Because the Coriolis effect, it basically asserts the polar opposite of that axiom, that the atmosphere is indeed traveling independent of the ground below. And I could cut in clips. I'm not very high tech right now because my computer is still broken, but you can find clips of examples where some clouds in the sky are traveling one direction and other clouds in the same visible sky are traveling in the opposite direction. You can have winds on the ground that are traveling in opposite directions as winds aloft. So this assertion that the atmosphere is tied, lockstep synchronized to the ground below is absurd. That's nonsense. It is necessary in order for the ball Earth logic to work. You have to have velcroed atmosphere to the ground because they have to have that excuse because of the airline flights conundrum. Now, again, and I've said this for about a decade, but this is something that I brought up when I was a little kid. The first time I ever took an airline flight, I remember I told my aunt when I arrived in Dallas Fort Worth Airport, flying out of Orlando, when I was traveling in the plane from Orlando to Dallas, I got bored and I was looking at the tickets trying to figure out how much shorter the flight to Texas was going to be and how much longer the return flight was going to take, because I just assumed that the Earth was a spinning ball and I assumed that it was going to be a much further flight when racing against the destination. And I was actually shocked as an 11-year-old kid or whatever to realize that the two flight durations were identical in terms of the itinerary or whatever. And so when I got off the plane, I think the way that I phrased it to my aunt was I said something along the lines of, well, I just realized that the Earth isn't spinning because look, here's the proof. The two flights are identical in duration. And what my aunt said to me all those years ago was, I don't understand that the airplane and the atmosphere are traveling in lockstep with one another. I mean, that is the only way that you can logically try to explain away or apologize for the ball. But if you actually take the time to think about this, there actually is no way that you could have a spinning ball Earth where these two flights would even be remotely similar in terms of duration. The only explanation that makes any sense is that the system itself is stationary. And yes, while you do have conditions of winds aloft that are going to vary, we're not seeing any evidence for supersonic axial rotation of the geological variety. It's just not happening because the Earth is a stationary plane. So I hope that helps. I've got tons of videos on this point and many others, and I'll try to cover some of the other um, incessant commentary that I get from the globbers, who never seem to concede when a valid point is made. But this is a globe killer. I mean, the fact that we have identical airline flight durations from east to west and west to east um, conclusively and irrevocably proves that the Earth is a stationary plane. All right, one love, you guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you real soon. Y'all be good.